Al aire.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning in Mexico City and good evening in Sweden. On behalf of the Electoral Institute of Mexico City, I cordially welcome you to this virtual international forum on challenges of citizens' participation in innovative scheme and in the face of extraordinary context. The Executive Office for Citizen Participation and Education of this institute is honored in organizing this international forum with the purpose of generating a space to reflect and discuss upon the challenges of citizen participation by the use of new technology, information technology and communication under extraordinary contexts like the ones we are now undergoing. This event is especially relevant for the Institute because thanks to the development of innovative and rapid updating of our capabilities, we are now able to meet the needs of the current circumstances. In this sense, you will be able to enjoy the broadcast of this event in the language of your preference, and in your bottom toolbar of Zoom, you will be able to find the options to choose the language in which you want to listen to this transmission. My name is Isela Gonzalez, and it is a great honor for me to cordially welcome you all. This international forum will take place for 2 days, today and tomorrow, and we will be having in this roundtable that is entitled Challenges of Citizen Participation and Modalities Before New Context. We have, for this purpose, the presence of electoral advisor Bernardo Valle Monroy, chairman of the Permanent Commission of Citizen Participation of this Electoral Institute. We also have the honor of having among us Dr. Tanya Rodriguez Mora, Mrs. Provost of the Mexico City Autonomous University. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Tanya Rodriguez. Mr. Advisor Valle, thank you very much for joining us. And at the end of this intervention, we will have the keynote address entitled Beyond Representative Governments: How the COVID-19 pandemic contributes to a more local, direct, digital, and transnational democracy. This keynote address will be given by Dr. Bruno Kaufmann, who is logging in all the way from Sweden. And he is the co-chairman of the commission, the Global Forum. Thank you very much. How is everything doing from there? Thank you very much. Can you listen to me fine and well? Because it seems that there's some echo and you are not being able to hear me very well. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaufmann, for joining us. Can you tell us through the chat whether you are hearing well? Because there are some who seem to be hearing with some echo, and we can have more interactive participation through the use of the chat. I will continue then so that the audio can be corrected. So I will just wait to receive the signal whether to continue as we have been doing. Thank you very much. So I was telling you that Dr. Kaufmann is joining us from Sweden, and he is the chairman of Global Forum on Modern Direct Democracy, which in 2021, this global forum will take place in Sweden, in Switzerland. And this global forum will be in Mexico City. So we are really very happy to have you among us here. We also would like to greet all people who are joining us and all the electoral advisors. Mauricio Huesca, thank you very much for joining us as well here. Good afternoon and good evening, good morning here. We would like to greet all the Electoral Institute advisors and all the members of the parliament and all the officials of the government of this city, and of course the members of community participation and all the people who are joining us through the chat and through different platforms through which we are coming to talk to you. Without further ado, I'd like to leave the floor to Advisor Huesca Rodriguez, who participates in our institute. And now microphone and cameras will be focused on Mr. Huesca Rodriguez, Advisor Counselor. Good morning. Thank you very much. This is the first international forum that the Commission of Citizen Participation is organizing. So I would like to thank the audience who are joining us here for coming to join us, and for the organizers for extending this invitation. Before introducing the panel members of this roundtable, I'd like to share with you some experiences and data on the political and citizen participation that we have experienced, particularly under these conditions in the view of the CORSAR to the coronavirus. On behalf of our institute, the global scale as of June of this year, 62 countries have been led to postpone their electoral processes. And in Latin America, 14 countries have had to postpone their elections for presidential term, general elections in Bolivia, the national referendum in Chile, and many others, and more than 1,000 meetings in Colombia, and other elections in Mexico, in Paraguay, Puerto Rico, and even in Uruguay. So countries and citizens where the elective processes are continuing, there have been several adaptation and health protection processes that have been implemented by the authorities in order to have elections free of transmission of the coronavirus. And so international-wide, together with the electoral network and the federal tribunal or court, electoral court in Mexico, have been working. And so there are different virtual meetings to analyze the problems and present options within this pandemics and the calendar of elections. This has been considered from the different organs. And first of all, public health is the most important aspect to be taken as consideration for decision making. We have to consider the political, financial, and legal aspects in order to change the citizens' participation election. And 3, we have to consider the impact of the electoral cycle. 4th, we have to consider the particular characteristics, geographical and political characteristics of different regions. And finally, the group of experts who have considered that any change has to be together with the opposition forces in the countries. One of the most important characteristics of democratic society is the participation of the citizens in the election of their governors. And this represents the best and more common way of the political conference. In Mexico, different studies have documented that the rate of participation is relatively low and is different among different types of elections. In the next election period, or in the past election period of 2018, the average was 68.4% of citizen participation, in contrast to the 52% in past elections. So it is quite low, and mechanisms of citizen participation that is very low might risk the possibility of participation. Different authors state that the lowest the participation of the citizens, less legitimate is the election of the representatives. So in the past few years, several studies have established the importance of the election of the citizens. The different authors have established that the postergation or postponement of the elections may have an impact, and democracy could have an impact because of an election that has that may be performed under circumstances like the one that we are having. And before this reality that goes beyond our control, we have to have this kind of control of forums like the ones we have here. So I'd like to introduce advisor Bruno Valle. He has a specialty in public finances, and since 2017 he has been electoral advisor in the Mexico City Electoral Court, and he has a master's degree and was Secretary General of the Electoral Court in Mexico City, and he was Executive Secretary of the prior Electoral Institute of the Federal District. And he will be talking about mechanism and instruments of citizen participation, innovative methodologies, and new forms of political participation. Let us pay attention to his presentation. Thank you very much, Mauricio, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon for those who come from other parts of the world. I kindly and cordially welcome and greet all of you who are following this broadcast. The purpose of this virtual forum has an objective to discuss and exchange ideas before the challenges that we will face in the future. Nobody can say that this pandemic was a surprise to all of us, and the consequences that we are experiencing today have developed measures that have made us to rethink again the way in which we are living and socializing today, and has changed the way in which society is organized, and also the way in which the relationships between the government and citizens is organized, and justice, implementation and enforcement will also have to be done. Political participation as a basis and citizens' participations as human rights is a challenge before this context where we have to highlight the right to health and life. That is why I will talk about an element that is very essential for our democratic society, and it's in the Constitution and the regulations in our country. The different reforms that we have seen in the 20th century and the ones that we have had in 21st century in matters of citizen participation in Mexico City in particular has had the purpose of overcoming certain backlashes that we had, and a difficulty in the decision making by the citizens in public business and matters. I would like to state that for more than 70 years in Mexico, we were in a single party regimen, and we were able to alternate the power since 2012, which didn't mean really that we had made a transition to whole democracy. Since the changes that the new Congress has been done and the amendments of 2018, the opposition was able to have higher representation in the Congress of the Union and thrust some changes that have been taking place slowly. One thing that we have to highlight that is that one of the main transformations that has had to do with the organizations of organizing the elections and the way in which the new political parties could have access to ballots and compete in citizens' elections. And also the laws that have been amended in the 20th century has seek the support of the citizens to guarantee quality and free elections. From a federal law since 1946, we have changed to a political process policy in 1997. After 1987, with the reform, the federal electoral code was established, and by 1991, there was a reform aimed at professionalizing elections, consummating in 1994 a reform that provides citizens' character to the electoral organ. By 2007, the implemented reforms were more focused on regulation mechanisms of political parties and reforms that would modify the electoral structures and the citizens' participations. After 2014, the election system was fundamentally changed, and there was an national organ organized to carry out the national and subnational elections. And the national authority is given local faculties, and initially it was a supervising organization that will foresee the local processes, but then it was granted the faculty and the authority to fiscalize the finances of the political parties and both the federal and local levels. We can say that the organization of elections in general has a robust and sound scaffolding for both the local and federal elections. And this summary is given for the purpose of you knowing the processes of democracy participation, and we can say that they are never exhausted. Since 1946 to 2014, there have been profound amendments and reforms, and so the context that we are experiencing now has to be considered from two different approaches so that the citizens can have involvement in political decisions. In the pandemics that we are experiencing, we have to rethink the way in which citizens can participate and guarantee their fundamental and essential right of being elected and electing. And secondly, because of the situation worldwide and the possibility of having authoritative governments, we have seen as a viable path the active participation of citizens through alternative mechanisms developed in different countries, and of which Mexico has a different variety, such as the mechanisms of citizens' participation and direct democracy. This binomial is essential for constitutional ruling and also the democratic participation of nations. And it is essential that both elements really confluence in situations that have, like today, put the world population in a risk. We will see that in the next 18 months, we have scheduled more than 18 elections, and in Latin America, more than 30. So many countries have decided to interrupt and postpone the election process, such as the case of Bolivia in its presidential election. The constituent referendum of Chile, the elections of Hidalgo and Coahuila in our country, they have been postponed until we have the proper conditions for their proper development. So it is not only the constitutional elections for the election of authorities in different levels of government have been postponed or temporarily canceled, but also processes of direct democracy, such as the plebiscite of the referendum of Chile has been postponed. In the case of Mexico, Hidalgo and Coahuila have an electoral process of 20 or 21, which may be subject to changes if the sanitary conditions do not improve. we have to rethink once again the way in which, first of all, we ensure the right to life and health as an essential principle, and secondly, to guarantee the essential right to voting, because it is right now in the process of risk and potentials of risk, and thirdly, to analyze the alternative mechanisms for voting to prevent any risk for the citizens so that we can have representative voting. In the midst of the pandemic, there have been some concerns about these postponements, and we have considered the possibility of postponing or canceling these processes. It is evident and natural that the political decisions have been focused on the sanitary condition. However, when these periods for the election of authorities have to be considered, we have to consider the democratic processes, which will not be the same as before the pandemic. We need to find exit programs in order to guarantee the freedoms and the election. And we have to consider all the technology tools available at present. Let me tell you that Mexico City has a long tradition in electronic remote voting, which can guarantee the participation of risk populations and other sectors of the population who don't want to expose themselves to the risk of the infection. That is why we have to consider that based on the demographic dynamics survey of 2018 April, there is 15.4 million people over the age of 60 in our country, of which 1.7 million live on their own. 4 out of every 100 persons living alone are economically active. And for the city of Mexico, we are estimating that there is 1,365,637 people, according to the information of CONABO. Not only that, 7 of every 10, that is almost 70% of people over 60 years of age who are living on their own, have certain kind of disability. And 7.7 million individuals in Mexico are disabled. Of them, 500 and 217 are inhabitants of Mexico City, according to the demographic survey of 2018. 75.3% of inhabitants over 20 years have obesity or overweight, according to the National Health Survey by the National Institute of Statistics and the National Institute of Public Health. So it is of the utmost importance to adopt measures that will enable the sectors that I've just mentioned not to have their rights for electoral participation to be canceled. And that is why we need to consider these advances that we've had. In the specific case of Mexico City, we have to acknowledge the development that we have had along the years that has ensured the voting of voters with the highest safety mechanisms and the development of internet access to it that enables electronic voting, both for electronic processes, so that we can obtain the voting from people abroad or even in Mexico. This electronic system is easy to handle and safe, but it preserves this voting free, secret, and intransferable. And this will guarantee its authenticity and ensure the transparency of elections, and that can be implemented irrespective of electoral processes or citizens' participation. These exercises where we have used electronic systems, we have been developing since 2011 as an additional mechanism of voting for people living abroad since 2012 on behalf of the government of this Distrito Federal or Federal District. We have also instrumented the different exercises of election and voting for citizens representation processes since 2012, which has generated a considerable experience and development of systems that enabled us to do this kind of activities. Throughout the course of this years, the Mexico City electoral system Institute has developed systems with the highest quality and safety measures, which include the archive of different information, the logical erasing and deletion of the information from the server's archives, and the safety of the participating individuals with their preliminary data, with the certainty that the opinion and view of each individual that are pertaining to the list of the Mexican citizens who vote may be secret, direct, and safeguarded and accounted for. And once they have decided their option, this system enables us to archive them in secrecy without anybody having access to it or visualizing it. Likewise, we can explore the likelihood of modifying the sense of voting before the closing of the period to exercise the voting as the user decides so, as a measure of safety, so that they can be issuing their vote according as with other kind of options. In electronic voting, we have a double identification code with a public key or password that is given via electronically, and a single token that is provided by the electronic system, so that when they issue their voting electronically, they can register this through a cell phone message. So we have this information, and we would have to think about different proposals for virtual forum that might be live. And we should be thinking about strategies so that citizens don't have to go to the boxes, and they might issue their voting. So this challenge in extraordinary court context is aimed at ensuring this process and accessibility to all citizens, and ensuring right of health and life as essential principles. It is imperative that we find all the means necessary to guarantee this. And this is current in the setting of having to postpone the election. So challenges of citizen participation, in addition to other elements of or instruments of participation, with other forum that may subject to public scrutiny the decisions of the government that may have an impact on the citizens. This is one of the main challenges in order to preserve our systems and processes. We need to consider the successful experiences that we've already explained to this. So we have to consider this binomial, elections and citizens participation. And in a context that we are having this in the world, it is essential that we have ensure all the documents for free participation of citizen, and seeking for alternatives that allow us to have an election exercises that may be representative of culture, and this would be essential for all of us. Thank you very much to all.
Muchas gracias al consejero Valle.
Thank you very much, Advisor Valle. And considering the risk of this contingency, and based on the experience that, as Bernardo Valle has already stated, with the electronic voting, this is applicable to the United States. In 21 states, there were primary elections, and some different modalities. In Kansas and Washington, elections have been done through mail, so that the citizen is completely coverage. And in Iowa, there was a decision for electoral voting with a paid stamp. And this is a debate with regards to the exercise for voting and the integrity of electoral processes. I mentioned this because in the elections, there was a precedent in mobile applications for information transmission. And in the United States, there was some Supreme Court questioning about this kind of voting. And the voting had to be sent 20 hours at the most. And this made the citizens, and even in Wisconsin, there was a process to be voting the Democratic position, and there was certain suppression of different boxes or ballot boxes. There were different problems, but derived from the Supreme Court of Justice. There were some limitations for the voting of people because of the lower number of these sites, and there were people who had to stay long lines before they had their presentation. I'd like to now introduce Ms. Tanya Rodriguez Mora, who has a PhD in social sciences with a specialization in sociology by the Colegio de México. She was granted an international diploma on continuing professional education and by the Interdisciplinary Research Center in Sciences and Humanities of the National University of Mexico. And so we would like to welcome her. She will be talking about citizen participation in the context of the new normal. Thank you very much to all, and good morning and good evening to all of you. I would like to express my appreciation for having been invited in order to discuss the challenges of citizen participation, and as you said, in extraordinary contexts. I think that this title was quite suggestive and provocative, so it's very I'm very pleased to be sharing this with our electoral advisors, and it's an honor to be here with Bruno Kaufmann sharing this reflection. Thank you very much.
Quería plantear justamente y empezar poniendo en la mesa.
I would like to put on the table this idea of the concept of extraordinary, which is the adjective that has been proposed to name the context that we are living now. With this idea of crisis, in the sense that extraordinary and in critical situations usually open an idea of rupture of the current order and the possibility of looking for and seeking for alternatives. And I believe that this impact of the pandemic is extraordinary and even immeasurable because of its complexity and magnitude. Its character is evident in which our commonplaces were broken. This idea of gathering was broken. The way in which we live and experience social interaction has completely changed. In the course of a few weeks, all around the world, there were changes in the notions of closeness and relations. We were reclassified socially, and the activities changed. Greetings were redefined. The idea of school was shaken. The labor structure was also shaken, and we had to be confined. The school institution, for instance, underwent a significant crisis as many others, and the space of the policy and politics has collapsed. We found that the social media were the ways of having a gathering together, and this is in the course of less than half a year. The old normality has to be reinvented. Are we going to go back to the previous normal? I think that part of it will survive. There's no question from my sociological background that we have to consider the social order and institution strength. However, it is true that this crisis will open changes, and the pandemic will foster the need to discuss future scenario and the way in which social and political discussions are redefined. In a forum such as this, where we are looking for ways of participating, we should wish that this extraordinary position opens up as an extraordinary possibility, and that the crisis redefines the way of living together, and be able to visualize and enjoy these new types of projects that will constitute the new normal, and that they can be openly, explicitly, and publicly discussed in a democratic fashion. If this is the case, we will respond to this crisis with participation. I think that this extraordinary time demands from all of us to be summing and assuming ourselves as part of those debates, and that we participate by becoming members of this participation, expressing this optimism in the likelihood of an organized democracy. I should, as Mr. Antonio Gramsci said in the past, to recognize the reasons that document the crisis as well. And that this crisis be developed in a brutally unequal structure that may raise conditions where these power relations may become solid. The pandemics can open the path to authoritarianism and reconsideration of public deliberations, and that is true as well. So we have to make a balance between the optimism of will and pessimism of diagnostic and conditions that we are experiencing. So from this position, I would like to attempt to do three things. First of all, to identify some spaces and practices that are subjected to extraordinary tensions and that visualize previously structured conflicts. I will identify among these spaces the alternatives deployed before us as emergent possibilities that may enable us to make inequality much more profound or release it from its inequality, and how these disputes may come together with different participation alternatives, and how they may strengthen political participation mechanisms. Before going into this exercise, I'd like to say that I would open to this option and this discussion more sociologically, where the idea comes from the following and the feeling of being part of it, and from this practice of collaboration, intervention, of feeling really a member and be considered as part of a debate where we have to consider a position and intervene. That is a social interaction towards the common and collective and the construction elements. Likewise, my notion of politicity is not restricted only to the political level or scope, which is very important and absolutely articulator of all these other elements, but which precisely I consider that the effect of the extraordinary of this crisis has to do with its redefinition. And I will open this to a more reflective logic with regards to the aspects of life that has been transformed by the pandemics. I think that the pandemic has bringing to evidence this situation. If we consider the discussions and debates that we had for many years by the academicians on the conditions of the mechanisms for reconstruction of biopolicies, I think that the pandemic and its effects can put into evidence clearly the persistence of public discussion on the ways of regulating life, of regulating bodies, of regulating the closeness, even closeness to our own bodies. I think that that has been quite notorious in this pandemic. I think that very evidently this dimension of life has been politicized. Likewise, I also consider, as you have well mentioned, that citizen participation is a clear indication, a clear mechanism of relationship between society and state. And this is where we can identify certain specific mechanisms, such as the capacity of incidence of people, institutions, and policies that reproduce social orders. And here I'm talking intentionally of the incidence of people, because I believe that the first topic of citizens' participation is to identify who is a citizen and who is not a citizen, who has more capacities and capabilities and who doesn't, and what are the settings in which we can participate, and how much we can participate, how often we can participate. That is the who's, the where's, and the when's of participation that is demanded. I am considering 7 spaces that I'd like to review in order to put them for the debate. And I believe that these are important because it's my impression that perhaps what could happen, and we don't know that yet because we are in a crisis, what we will see coming is decision making with regards to all these positions. We don't know if this public decision will be the product of a democratic process in the best of conditions, but there will be social decision makings on these many topics, because the pandemics and its social presence and that is experienced by all the population have obliged us to rethink this. How are we going to place ourselves in the face of this? And that is why we have the need to participate, to debate them, to have a public discussion that is empowered on all these issues. I will consider 7 aspects, and I will briefly touch upon them. First of all is the first problem. If the pandemic really normalizes or denormalizes the problem of social inequality. 2, whether it shakens the labor world or not, and if it has a discussion on life and health, if it centralizes the digital elements and as a means to discussion, if the pandemic replaces us in terms of the relationship with knowledge, that is, I'm referring to the institution of school and science, and if the pandemic is really defining the public and the private and political, that is to say. These are the 7 elements. And each one of these 7 elements, I will try to identify certain aspects to see what we can debate upon and what participatory practices can be derived from each one of these 7 elements. The first one, the pandemic normalizes or denormalizes social inequality. In these few months, perhaps one of the most important discussions in the public setting, particularly in an international left orientation or left intellectualism, has made some advances in terms of the crisis derived from COVID-19, will put at risk the different public policies of the past 30 years. If this is the crushing point of a social neoliberal concept of societies, institutions, and the way in which we reproduce life. Likewise, at the same time, we are debating whether the pandemics, very evidently, is really making more acute the discriminating and exploitation fashions that are already existing. So the question here is whether the coronavirus pandemics can derive into a new collective bargaining with regards to construct society where the ideas of social, economic, right to health, conceptions and participations of elections and society and state relations can advance, or whether the pandemics could bring regressive scenarios. It is true that the pandemic is really making visible the inequality. The virus is present as a homogenizing agent at present. We are all very afraid of becoming ill. This is a homogeneous element. But the disease, however, shows that we may become ill, but not in the same way, or that not all of us have the same possibility of getting ill, and that the pandemic affects more some people than others. I think that the core idea in this debate is the following. If the citizen as a political category in general is really homogenizing us in terms of the political rights, but in the exercise of these rights, we come across inequalities, different capabilities, and different ways of exercising. And this is a central point where the debate on the normalization of social differences or denormalization, even in the presence of a disease, has to be debated. The main example to illustrate this is the following. It is evident that the highest rates of disease have been concentrated in our city, in the area of Iztapalapa, or in the city of New York at the Bronx. However, that concentration that may seem like very evident does not necessarily pose an explanation of putting at risk inequality. Why do people get sick? Because of their social conditions that can be read in two ways. Yes, on the one part, we need to build another structure of ways of life for those people to prevent them from getting ill, or, and this is the part of public deliberation and why is it important, to point out that the people might get ill because that's where they get ill, and stop reproducing with the argument, with this discussion, an argument that might be discriminatory. And I think that this is a very important element that we'll have to do on how to discuss this issue of the differences in which we exercise our rights, and we become collective actors or stakeholders, members of the citizens of Mexico City in this particular case, and at the same time we are differentiated, and how we have to include different mechanisms. We need public deliberation in this sense, and we need to restitute the voice to these stakeholders to prevent the construction of narratives that may be stigmatizing. And we need to learn from participation mechanisms the conditions in which they can participate and we can overcome the situation. This with regards to aspect number one. Aspect number two, I think that there's something core in this discussion that disappeared in the public debate that has to be with the centralization of the work or labor, and dehumanization has been, overcome by the pandemic. It's been quite important and interesting to see how we have repositioned ourselves before our jobs because of the need to follow the priority activities or not. New social sectors have reappeared or appeared, or the whole organization of distant jobs or working, the redesign of offices or factories and so on, and also the idea of scarcity of jobs. This has generated a discussion that it seems to me is going to be very important. But what does labor have to do with citizen participation? If we recall the long process of democratic mechanism processes during the 19th and 20th century. It is precisely in the great debates of labor policies debates where we innovated many of the participations and political action were developed and that are part of our current conditions from different different problems from unions and strikes and everything, but also from a Descartes standpoint, the idea of communities organized in such a way that they have an impact in the parliaments and public life and having a decision on something that is core, which is labor or work. I think this is important. I think that there will be a significant discussion, and the definition of this debate derived from rethinking policies such as universal health, basic income, everything that has to do with social life, the basics of social life, will strengthen the social participation or weaken it in terms of social participation. I think that having life and health together is crucial. There's a central part here. The public debate has repositioned a topic that had been already present in discussions, but let us remember what happened in the United States, as Advisor Huesca was saying, with regards to the political dynamics in the United States and what is happening around this debate. Well, precisely one of them was the health system and the mobilization of this topic in the public discussion. In the pandemics, we are focusing on life, on right to health, and recategorization of peoples. I think that this is a very important public policy discussion with regards to political rights, what happens with the vulnerable populations and frail social groups with these recategorizations that are very strong. Just pointing out the importance of public discussion with regards to aging at this point in time, where the mobility electoral rights of a broad sector of the population is being crossed with a sanitary policy, which is aiming at not putting at risk their own rights as people. And we should not consider the care and sanitary processes as part of it. I don't have much time, but I would point out that digital technology is central, but there's some gap. I think that the political aspect also touch upon the domestic aspects of the people, and we have had to optimize our personal small spaces, our homes, and that is how we can get together. And that is an element that could be very potential in order to divide the sexual participation in labor, for instance. And also there's a need for science and discuss and be informed so that we can make decisions around health. So pandemic has redefined our ideas of the public and politicas, and it is through participation, that is being part with the capacity of individuals to have an impact, that we will be able to focus and overcome and have different options. We would like to thank you for your presentation. I think that it is an essential element, the incidence of the citizens in social decision-making in a context of sanitary crisis, as you mentioned well. There are multifactorial conditions that would make citizens not to participate in decision-making, and these have to do with technology processes, because their priorities of population are not necessarily to participate, but to meet some demands such as food, health, safety, which was not necessarily the cause of a pandemic, but it is coming to the visualization of everybody. those who vote increase the possibilities of being included in the adopted political decision making. And so the lack of participation might lead to inequalities, and there will be problems of representative among the civil groups. We could see absenteeism in the next elections. And of course, one of the main problems of absenteeism is the lack of legitimization of the process electoral. So we are going to go now to the Q&A session that I have received two. This one is for Mr. Eduardo Valle. Local events should open more spaces for citizens' participation. How can citizens open up more spaces? Another question, oftentimes there are options for participation by the citizens. So what should democratic institutions do in order to reach people, and why this hasn't happened? And Dr. Rodriguez, what is the role of universities and educational institutions in citizens' education for participation? And another one is, there was no possibility for electronic vote. That is a comment. And scrutiner, maybe those individuals in charge of scrutinizing the votes might put their health at risk. There's another question for Dr. Tanya. How educational institutions and those who are implementing processes, democratic processes, can some efforts for the betterment of the communities? I will leave these questions for you to respond. We will give 5 minutes to each one of you. So we can use the same order. I will leave the floor now to my colleague, Bernardo. I will answer to the first question, opening more spaces for citizen expressions. I think that this is a challenge for the authorities, the opening of greater spaces so that we can expand communication with citizens. The Electoral Institute of Mexico City, we can do it through the tools that we have from the law of citizen participation. And this is how we've been expanding these mechanisms. We have a digital platform at present where we have tools that enable a dialogue or a permanent deliberation between the citizenship and the Electoral Institute of Mexico City, which enables to improving communication and will set points of opportunity for discussion. I think that our law for citizens' participation includes mechanisms that are quite broad, such as referendums, consultation of the civil society. And so I think that by using all of them, we will have the opportunity to improve communication between citizens and authorities. With regards to the second question, where there is this misinformation among the citizens and how the democratic authorities will work to reach people, I think that this is precisely the proposal that we are experiencing now. And this is a proposal that the Electoral Institute of the City of Mexico is looking forward to establish the digital platform for digital voting and electronic voting, so that we can reach the citizens in the city, so that we can improve the citizen participation. With regards to the question of Hidalgo, I think that it is precisely the internet electronic voting process is precisely what we are trying to develop. We are going to ensure, or we are striving to ensure the participation of people, so that we can provide you with the necessary tools and prevent any transmission of the disease from happening, and providing with the necessary equipment to protect their healths. And the other question that has to do with the co-payments, the co-pacos, that is to say, if 9 out of 10 people from them are corrupt and they only look for their personal interest, can we do other things? And people with disability oftentimes cannot exercise their right to vote because of the discrimination in Mexico City. So what are the actions that the Institute will do to guarantee human rights? And will there be educated and trained personnel to guarantee this right? At the Institute, what we have been seeking is to have the greatest training capacities for our staff so that they can meet the needs of the citizens and provide them with the tools that are necessary to facilitate the voting for those people with some kind of disability. And the internet electronic vote is one of the other possibilities where they can also exercise their vote without having to go to the ballot booth. And with regards to the community participation opaque processes, at the end of the day, we can say that decisions are made in a majority fashion, but if there is an illegal act through internet, we will proceed legally. And it will not be the COPACO, but the electoral court that will resolve the problem. Thank you very much. Thank you, Advisor Valle. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Tanya. I think it's great to hear the efforts that the public institutions such as the Electoral Institute is doing to guarantee the exercise of political rights. But as we said before, the crisis that we are facing will pose different challenges because this new circumstances is articulated with a historical complexities of citizens' participation problems. So how do we participate? That is, become part of, assume our responsibilities, and trying to have any impact on the people so that people may be better informed and have the rights to express themselves, and that their opinion is important in the issuing of public policies and reconstitution of human rights that we have to overcome as a society. I think that educational institutions here have a core responsibility for sensitization, information of the citizens. It's been said that citizen is not pointed as citizens because there is abstract right. No, it's an exercise of empowerment and creating incidence capacities. It is a construction of something public and collective, and we have to be part of them. A situation such as the pandemic has clarified that nobody can face a health problem alone. Nobody can remedy the problem of health alone. It requires this working together as a society, and it's important to have an incidence according to where we participate. I think that we are having an impact on all our lives, and it has to be politicized in the best possible notion of the concept. And this is related to the relationship to knowledge, to science, and the discussion with the schools and the education institutions, because we are seeing millions of schools and students getting out of our classrooms, and sometimes it depends on the gaps, digital gaps in each country. We might be in our digital settings, or we have been able to make the best possible efforts in order to continue having a relationship with our our students' communities. It is clear now more than ever that we need to continue having these liaisons, these relationships. Society and schooling and participation, they all go hand in hand. We participate when we feel that we are part of others and that we can have an impact on others. And this can be learned at different levels and multiple spaces that are not necessarily only the formal political ones, but the way of relationships in schools, the way of students and teachers interact, how to establish this is a central element. Likewise, something additional as a university a stakeholder, I think that the university community become part actively in the discussion that has to debate the public discussion so that we can guide and orient citizens, not to tell them what they have to do, but rather to pose a series of arguments towards the political decision stakeholders, but also the society, so that they can make a decision on how to provide care for life, which is basic. And I think that this is a virtuous exercise of thinking of ourselves as participating in a public debate in a situation that is extraordinary like this one. I thank you very much for inviting me, and hopefully we can continue striving and thrusting this strengthening of citizens and community. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Tanya. This is an invitation for all the citizens to construct society and social weavers. We conclude now the first part of our roundtable, and we will take a few minutes for those who want to follow the indications to listen in Spanish so that they can change their language preference in order to give way to the keynote address by Dr. Bruno Kaufmann.
Gracias, consejero.
Thank you very much. We will now continue. In the description box, you will see the indications for change of language. You can do it now, and we will continue. Thank you very much. Without further ado, let us hear our keynote address by Dr. Bruno Kaufmann. I will give you a very brief resume. He has been very active as co-founder and co-chair of Global Forum of Modern Direct Democracy. As a political scientist, he has authored several publications on direct democracy at the local and multinational level. He presides the European Initiative of Referendum Institute that gathers a group of multinational experts devoted to research and education on procedures and practices of modern direct democracy. He is a correspondent of the Swiss Broadcasting Company as chief editor of the Global People to Power.info media initiative that covers democratic matters around the world.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you tonight. Good evening from Europe. It has been said that I'm in Sweden now, but in fact I'm still in Switzerland. I'm on my way to Sweden. In an hour I will board a night train to northern Germany, and then from there the boat back to Sweden. So I'm on my way, and that's also the reason why I will not be able to do it too long. So I will try to be a little bit short and to also give you an impression about how the mood is here in Europe when it comes to pandemic and democracy. Because we had this weekend, for instance, we had 3 major elections. We had the local elections in the second round of the local elections in France. and we had the first round of the presidential election in Poland and also the presidential election in Iceland. In fact, these elections were partly postponed. The election in Poland should have taken place in May, but it was postponed to today, and the second round will be in 2 weeks. In France, the first round of the local elections were held in March, and now the second round was held. And in Iceland, they did it in a quite smart way. They made the voting period 5 weeks, so people could go basically to the ballot station one by one. They could also book a time at the ballot station to be alone. So it's in fact possible, of course, to hold elections even in ballot stations, but the challenges are very big. And I will share now a little bit of my slides to give you an idea about let's say, what are the pandemic challenges to citizens' participation and approaches of innovation. We can say that democracy is really going through a big check just now. It's a health check on democracy, because this crisis can be seen as a magnifying glass to things which are working good and things which are not working good at all. The pandemic democracy has also a very big influence on the developments in many countries. The Gothenburg-based VDEM, Varieties of Democracy Institute, has done something called the pandemic backsliding risk, where you have mapped all the world and where you can see where democracy under these circumstances is getting worse, or where it can be kept like it is today. And you see on this map that many countries in Latin America, in Africa, also in Europe and Asia are really under big risk, are red, high risk for a backsliding of democracy, while others have a medium risk, like Russia and the United States or Argentina, and also a certain number of countries, including Mexico in this index, is not in the first place for backsliding under these circumstances, and that is, of course, somewhat positive news for you. Now, we have also seen, as Mauricio in the beginning really has underlined, that many countries have postponed their elections while others have held them. And you can see that the yellow countries here have postponed their elections, while the blue ones have held elections, also sometimes on the local level. So it's a development which is really all over the world. And the big chance, of course, for us is that we can compare so well this. Tanya has also said it. I mean, this is really concerning all of us. It's concerning us as individuals, as bodies, as human beings, but also as societies and as political systems. And this is, for our issue, of course, very important. In the background, you can say that we are always talking about the modern concept of representative democracy according to the Human Rights Declaration, where in Article 21.1 it is clearly said that everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. So direct and indirect democracy are both part of it. We can also say that in the let's say in the last 25 or 50 even years, democracy has been on the rise all over the world. Many countries have improved their democracies, while others, of course, have become much more under pressure. But the idea of democracy has become much bigger. In that way, we can say that modern representative democracy has become, in the last decades, even more local, more participatory and digital. And I will go through what that means and also what the pandemic means to that. The world of democracy, when you go really into depth, is of course very interesting, because we see a lot of local, regional, subnational practices, ideas, innovations of democracy, which are very important. It's not just what's happening on the national level, it's as much as important what's going on the local level. And again, the pandemic have shown that it's not necessarily the national leaders which are showing the way, but very often the local leaders, the mayors around the world, who are doing the big job. We have also Bernardo talked about it, about the solution to in a way, holding elections through e-voting. And also this is a global issue that many countries are discussing, are testing forms of e-voting. Myself, as a citizen of both Switzerland and Sweden, I had in the last 10 years the chance to vote in about 100 elections and referendums through the internet. But just now this is discussed again very much also in Switzerland. But in the end, of course, I'm not seeing any way around that we will have to use, and it's also meaningful, and it will also include many more people who today have a problem, for instance, for certain limitations in their possibility to attend a ballot box or to write, to also use it digitally. We have in recent years seen many interesting forms which are going beyond voting through digital means. For instance, in Taiwan, where we held our last global forum, we could learn a lot about their so-called We Taiwan platform, which invites people to be part of the legislative process as it is discussed in the parliament and in the political parties. It's the idea that the votes of the citizens are, of course, counted on election day, but also that the voices of the people are heard every day in between. In Finland, for instance, we have an interesting national platform called democracy.fi, which includes all formal ways of participating, like citizen initiatives, like European citizen initiatives. You can gather signatures, but also you get all the information. It's an important part of an infrastructure. And we see it also on the local level all around the world, that more and more cities are introducing forms like you have in Mexico about participatory budgeting. A very powerful place for that is the capital of France, Paris, where in fact the mayor Hidalgo was re-elected yesterday with a very clear result. So I would like to go through some of the aspects, from the principles to the procedures and practices to the infrastructure and communication, about participatory, direct and modern representative democracy, which are important in times of pandemic. In fact, the principles, of course, of modern representative democracy are based on the three principles of the rule of law, the delegation of power, but also citizens' participation. It cannot be limited to one of them. It's not enough to have the rule of law when you don't have properly elected bodies and when you don't have citizen participation. And it's not enough to have just delegating powers. You need also to keep them for the citizen in a permanent way. And for this, the principles need to be implemented through a proper court system, an institutional system, through political parties, and also through citizens as stakeholders of democracy. When it comes to procedures, it's about appointing key people in the institutions in a transparent and open way. It's about holding elections, which your institute, of course, is a key player in ensuring. And also it's about having the right for initiatives and referendums on issues. And for that, you need the transparency about the appointment system, about the openness and the fairness of it. You need the electoral code to ensure free and fair elections, and you need forms of direct democracy. When it then comes to the practices, we can really measure the quality of and the viability of this system through looking into how the practices are evolving. When it comes to the institutions, it's clear that in a democracy, the institutions need to have an autonomy. They shouldn't be just run by the political leadership. When it comes to the political parties and the politicians, you need a clear culture of accountability and also a system to make that accountable. And you need these forms of participation to ensure that the citizens can be involved. And in all these three practices, the key word for everything is dialogue. Dialogue between the institutions and the political system and the citizens, and on the other side, of course, the dialogue of the politicians with their electors and vice versa, and finally the dialogue in between citizens. So in an interim balance, you can say that the modern representative democracy is about conversation instead of confrontation that never ends. It's a conversation that never ends, and it's focused on this dialogue. Now, as a fourth and fifth point, I think the infrastructure for modern democracy is what we maybe at some point in the past have underestimated in its importance, that we need an infrastructure for modern democracy, which is quite big, quite broad, and really integrating everybody. It needs to be public, it needs to include the society, and it also needs to have clear institutional setups. I mean, as it is the public infrastructure, you see that institutions like your electoral bodies or even the city governments are an important infrastructure for modern democracy, while when it comes to the public and the society, we need free and open and well-supported NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and we need furthermore institutions which are able to support and help this. The academia, the universities, the media, public media and private media are very important factors. And for this also, we have a fifth point, which is communication, which needs to be for a democracy to work well. It needs to be both educative, so we can learn. It needs to be informative, so we know what things are going on, and it needs to be conversational in a way that we are encouraged and we are enabled to be involved in the dialogue. For this, you need civics, you need public education in the public sphere, you need clear institutions of media and also guides, information to the people so they know how they can use it. And of course, and this is maybe the key point, you need participation in practice. Without participation in practice, you cannot learn, you cannot develop, and you cannot create this kind of responsible citizenship, trust into the institutions. You need to know it, you need to meet, you need to be able to have a say, otherwise it's just an abstract, nice model. So let me go to my conclusions, that a modern representative democracy really requires autonomous institutions which are not politically biased. That a modern representative democracy requires responsible servants of the people, which are the elected politicians, and they have to behave like servants of the people and not like those who are directing the people. And you need tools of participatory and direct democracy at all levels. And this is, in a way, the culture of a modern democracy, which requires a strong commitment, which is institutionalized to a conversation. This produces peace and wealth, while if you have poorly confrontative, a competitive political system where everybody just wants to win and the loser is basically out of the game, this produces, of course, not this benefit, what we call democracy, which is the contrary of peace and wealth, which is violence and poverty. And you can quite clearly also see how a democratic system is working if it's really creating more peace and wealth, or if it's creating more violence and poverty. And luckily, in these times of the pandemic, you can see that the stronger points or the stronger elements are strengthened, while the weaker and the more confrontative parts are in a way also weakened. We have seen in recent months that, for instance, classical populist leaders, which are based on confrontation, of polarization, they have done much less successful than those who are open to dialogue, because everybody knows this is not just about indicating an enemy. There is no enemy in that way that you can just point on, but there is a common challenge and everybody needs to be involved. I think this is very important for our discussion, and we have tried from our work from the Initiative Referendum Institute, from the Global Forum, to contribute with some kind of recommendation and criteria, for instance, through the Global Passport to Modern Direct Democracy. And we are inviting all of you, and we are also inviting ourselves to do this further conversation. We will have the 2021 Global Forum in Switzerland, here in Switzerland next year. And I'm very much looking forward to our big global forum in 2022, in the end of 2022 in Mexico City, to continue this conversation, to learn from each another. Gracias very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Muchas gracias al Dr. Kaufmann.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaufmann. We will now open the Q&A session. And we have received a couple of questions that I would like to present to Dr. Kaufmann. The first one, in your experience worldwide, what are the countries with the best examples of citizens' participation exercises? And the second one is, what is happening with countries who have already electronic citizens' participation to ensure clarity and confidence in their voting, in electronic voting? The next question is, he is asking the question in English. I'm sorry. And these are the questions for Dr. Bruno, so I would leave the floor to for him to give the answers to the questions.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, there's always a tendency to try to see democracy as a competition where there are good and bad democracies. It's of course like that democracy cannot just be seen as a model where you can move a certain experience from one country to another, because democracy is the space where citizens can be involved in the government, and this looks different from country to country. But after all, of course, we have a lot of experience looking out over the world, which kind of tools are working. And I said it again, it's not enough to have fine regulations in your constitutions and legislations when you don't really have a practice. I myself, I had the chance and opportunity to participate in more than 1,000 elections and referendums in the last 30 years, which means that in Switzerland, for instance, where I'm a citizen, but also in Sweden, these institutions are working quite well because they can be used. While other countries, I'm just, for instance, working on a new law together with friends in the Ukraine, they cannot be used because the hurdles are too high. The political system is not really welcoming. So you can quite easily check that. A good example where the progress has been made in the last years is the country of Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, where they had a provision for good direct democracy already in the constitution. They hadn't any legislation for it because those in government were not interested to use it. So it took civil society a lot of work to pressure it and to create rules which are working. And now the people of Taiwan can use it. They, after the change of the legislation, they could already put 10 votes on the national ballot, which means that in Taiwan, for instance, now you need just 0.5% of the citizens to put an issue to the vote. And they took away the thresholds before, which made most votes invalid. So there are a certain criteria which you can see. And of course, there are traditional countries which have used a more participatory approach, like Uruguay, for instance. It's one of the most leading countries when it comes to this. But also in Europe, several countries who were leaving communism, they have developed good forms like Estonia, where e-voting has been used for more than 15 years. And going to e-voting, it's of course a little bit of a nice invitation to use the digital means for electronic means. But in the end, it's also about trust into the system. So if you have an electoral system where people not really trust into the institutions who are doing the elections, or if there are huge forces trying to undermine the political system, political process of elections, it's a big challenge to do it electronically as well, because the trust and the mistrust still will be there as it is before. So you need to be very cautious in using these tools and developing step-by-step procedures. But it's a real importance to develop that, but I don't see a very quick way to just change to digital means. What I can see that the pandemic really contributes to is that institutions, countries which have been very skeptical about digital democracy or e-voting, they are now for the first time really checking it out. And that's already a big progress, because in the end, we need, for instance, to have systems where people, when they feel that they have, for instance, be pressured to vote in a certain way because they do it from home, they can do the votes again as many times they want, so only the last vote will be valid. We need to develop this kind of system so people really have a trust in it. And of course, also we need to develop systems which are open and transparent enough without risking the secrecy of the vote. And that's the big challenge. And I think we are now in this month of the global pandemic doing a lot of lessons. We learn a lot. And I want to conclude with that. Many times crises in the world, big crises like world wars, like financial crashes, in the beginning, they have created a lot of, let's say, fear, a lot of polarization, but at the same time, they also created a lot of innovative thinking, a lot of new ideas. So I'm in a way quite optimistic that also this crisis will contribute to a collective learning process, which we afterward will say this was a big progress for democracy in the world.
Pues agradecemos las palabras de...
We would like to thank the responses of Dr. Kaufmann. And with this, we would like to end our excellent event. And I would like to close with the following reflection. This social and economic society where it seems that it is very difficult to breathe in this scarcity situation, poverty, and sometimes hunger environments, and the questioning to institutions, political changes for the next electoral processes and what will happen after the pandemics, how much the crisis will last. Well, according to the United Nations study, poverty can affect more than 500 million people in addition to the already poor people. So a large percentage of the population will be poor. This pandemic only revealed and disclosed what really happens in terms of inequality and poverty in our great societies. And that is why I think Dr. Bruno Scave's conclusion is very important. We cannot bet that digitalization of democracy is the only option, because we don't have the same privileges or the same options, not even in a city like Mexico City. So just transferring an electronic cost will have to be really analyzed carefully in a contingency like this one. Likewise, there has to be a weighting of the benefits, like the right to health and political participation. There will be mechanisms for participation that might be the most ideal and effective and efficient, so that we can have this type of exercises of political party renovation and political positions established. So I would like to thank everybody joining us in the different media for joining us, and I will leave the floor to Elisa so that she can adjourn the presence. Thank you very much, advisor, and to our speakers of this morning. Thank you very much to our moderator as well. It's wonderful to know that by 2020, we will have in Mexico City the Global Forum on modern direct democracy. So we will have to prepare ourselves so that we can be city site of the greatest level. We thank you to the observation network that greet us from the chat and all the people who wrote comments in the chat. By the way, if there are any more questions or after the reflections this afternoon, you wish to continue sending your messages, questions, or comments, we are available through our social media, and our colleagues are going to be reading your messages and comments. We will also have an email address, which is foro.participo@IECM, so that you can continue sending your questions, comments, and anything else that you need. So in this manner, we can conclude our first international virtual international forum on challenges of citizen participation and innovative schemes in the face of extraordinary context. Hopefully, all the information that has been presented here can enrich the knowledge that we already have, and that the sum of Wales' efforts and talents can help in your communities. Please don't forget that tomorrow we have an appointment in this same YouTube institutional channel, and we will share some practical experiences that we have had from different parts. And so we reconvene tomorrow. All your questions, all your comments, we will be attentive to read them and respond to them. We are really very grateful for all the people who connected and joined us. We had around 1,000 people at the peak. Sometimes it's difficult to read all the questions, but they will be recorded and we will be responding to them. So on behalf of the Electoral Institute of Mexico City, we cordially adjourn this meeting. We wish you the best of afternoons and evenings. Have a great day, good evening in Sweden, and good afternoon in those countries where this is afternoon. Thank you very much. We reconvene tomorrow.